Picture this, it's 20,000 years ago. The world is a frozen wasteland. Glaciers stretch as far as the eye can see, temperatures have plummeted to deadly lows, and most of the planet looks like an uninhabitable ice cube. This is the last glacial maximum, the peak of the Ice Age. Now here's the mind-blowing part. While woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats were going extinct left and right, our ancestors with no modern technology, no heated homes, no grocery stores not only survived but actually thrived. How the answer will completely change how you think about human ingenuity and survival. What early humans did to conquer the ice wasn't just clever, it was absolutely genius. Let me take you back to a world that would make today's worst winter storm look like a gentle spring breeze. We're talking about 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum. This wasn't just a really cold period in Earth's history. This was nature's ultimate test of human endurance, a planetary deep freeze that lasted thousands of years. Imagine waking up to a world where ice sheets, not just snow, but massive glaciers, thousands of feet thick, covered most of North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. We're talking about ice so thick, it could bury modern skyscrapers completely. The Laurentide ice sheet alone stretched from the Arctic Ocean down to what we now call New York City. That's like having a frozen continent sitting on top of half of North America. But here's where it gets truly terrifying. Global temperatures were about 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than today. That might not sound like much, but it's the difference between a world where humans can thrive and a world that's essentially uninhabitable. Most of Europe looked like modern-day Antarctica. The Mediterranean Sea was partially frozen. Even tropical regions were cold and dry. Now, here's the kicker. While all this was happening, our ancestors were out there, not just surviving, but actually spreading across the globe. They were crossing frozen continents, adapting to environments that would kill most modern humans within hours, and somehow managing to raise families and build communities in conditions that make the Arctic look cozy. The question isn't just how they survived, it's how they managed to do it so successfully that we're here today, 20,000 years later, telling their story. What they accomplished wasn't just survival, it was one of the greatest triumphs in human history. To really understand what our ancestors were up against, we need to dive deeper into the daily reality of Ice Age life. This wasn't like camping in winter where you can retreat to a warm cabin. This was permanent, relentless, life-threatening cold that never let up. The wildlife around them was either dying off rapidly or had evolved into massive, dangerous predators. Woolly mammoths, giant cave bears, saber-toothed cats, and dire wolves roamed the frozen landscapes. These weren't just big animals, they were apex predators perfectly adapted to the cold. With thick fur, massive claws, and an attitude that said everything smaller than me is food. Food sources were incredibly scarce. There were no forests full of nuts and berries, no abundant rivers teeming with fish, no vast grasslands where you could gather roots and plants. The plant life that did exist was sparse, tough, and often buried under feet of snow and ice. Most of the familiar food sources that earlier humans had relied on were either extinct or completely inaccessible. Water was another massive challenge. Sure, there was plenty of ice around, but try melting enough ice to keep a family hydrated using primitive tools and limited fuel. Every drop of drinking water required precious energy and resources to obtain. Rivers were frozen solid for months at a time, and even when they thawed, they were often toxic with glacial runoff. The clothing situation was equally desperate. Animal hides were the only option for staying warm, but these had to be perfectly prepared and maintained. One tear in your winter clothing could mean hypothermia and death. There were no backup outfits, no spare boots, no emergency blankets. The more you dig into the archaeological evidence, the more mind-blowing this Ice Age survival story becomes. We're not talking about small groups of humans barely scraping by in caves. We're talking about thriving communities that were actively exploring, innovating, and expanding their territories during the worst climate conditions in human history. Archaeological sites from this period show something incredible. Humans weren't just surviving, they were creating sophisticated tools, developing complex hunting strategies, and even engaging in long-distance trade. Sites in Europe show evidence of materials that came from hundreds of miles away, which means these primitive humans had established trade networks that spanned entire continents during an ice age. The bone tools found from this period are works of art, needles so fine they could sew intricate clothing, spear points designed with aerodynamic precision, and multi-tool implements that served dozens of functions. These weren't crude cave-dweller tools, they were sophisticated instruments, designed by people who understood physics, engineering, and craftsmanship at a level that would impress modern manufacturers. But perhaps most remarkably, this is when human creativity absolutely exploded. The famous cave paintings at Lascaux, Chauvet, and dozens of other sites were created during or right after the Ice Age. These aren't simple stick figures, they're sophisticated artistic representations that show detailed knowledge of animal behavior, hunting techniques, and even astronomical observations. Think about that for a moment. While struggling to survive in conditions that would challenge modern survival experts with all their gear, our ancestors found time and energy to create some of the most beautiful art in human history. They weren't just surviving, they were living, creating, and expressing themselves in ways that still move us to tears today. This tells us something profound about human nature. When faced with the ultimate survival challenge, humans didn't just adapt, they innovated, collaborated, and created. The Ice Age didn't make us weaker, it made us more resourceful, more creative, and more human than ever before. So how exactly did they pull this off? The answer lies in a series of revolutionary survival strategies that were so effective they literally shaped the course of human evolution. Here's something that will blow your mind. While you're probably reading this in a centrally heated building with insulated walls and double-pane windows, early humans figured out how to stay warm in Ice Age conditions using nothing but mammoth bones, animal hides, and sheer ingenuity. And get this, their heating systems were so efficient, they could maintain comfortable living temperatures even when it was 40 degrees outside. Let me paint you a picture of what archaeologists discovered in places like Mazirek, Ukraine. Picture walking across a frozen landscape and suddenly coming across what looks like a series of large, dome-shaped structures. But as you get closer, you realize these aren't made of wood or stone, they're made entirely of mammoth bones. Hundreds of them, carefully arranged and interlocked to create some of the most sophisticated shelters in human history. These weren't thrown together haphazardly. Each mammoth bone house required the bones from about 30 woolly mammoths, and they were arranged with architectural precision that would make modern engineers jealous. The massive skulls formed the foundation, creating a circular base about 12 to 15 feet across. The long leg bones were then arranged vertically to create the walls, with the curved tusks forming elaborate doorways and support structures. But here's where it gets really clever. The builders didn't just stack bones randomly. They understood load distribution, structural integrity, and even aerodynamics. The dome shape wasn't just aesthetically pleasing, it was the most efficient. Designed for shedding wind and distributing the weight of snow loads, these structures could withstand blizzards that would collapse modern tents in seconds. The construction process itself was a marvel of early engineering. First, they'd dig a shallow pit to create a foundation below ground level. This provided extra insulation and protection from wind. Then they'd carefully select and position each bone, using wooden wedges and stone tools to lock everything in place. The entire structure was then covered with layers of animal hides, creating a weatherproof shell that could keep the interior warm and dry for months. And we're not talking about cramped, uncomfortable spaces. These mammoth bone houses were spacious enough for entire families, with designated areas for sleeping, cooking, toolmaking, and storage. Now, building the structure was only half the battle. The real genius lay in how early humans turned these bone shells into livable, comfortable homes. The heating and ventilation systems they developed were so sophisticated that they solved problems modern architects still struggle with today. The key was understanding thermal dynamics in ways that seem almost impossible for primitive people. They created what we now call a thermal mass system. The mammoth bones themselves acted as heat absorbers during the day. They'd slowly warm up from the fire and body heat inside the shelter. At night, when temperatures plummeted, these bones would gradually release that stored heat, keeping the interior temperature relatively stable. But the real breakthrough was their ventilation system. These weren't stuffy, smoke-filled caves. Early humans figured out how to create controlled airflow that would keep fresh air circulating while preventing heat loss. They'd position the entrance at a slight angle and create small vents near the top of the dome, allowing fresh air to come in at ground level while letting smoke and stale air escape through the ceiling. The flooring system was equally ingenious. They'd create multiple layers. First, a base of small stones for drainage, then layers of bone fragments and ash for insulation, and finally, carefully prepared animal hides for comfort and warmth. This created a floor that was not only comfortable to walk and sleep on but also provided excellent insulation from the frozen ground below. Storage was another crucial element. They created built-in storage systems using the natural spaces between bones, creating compartments for food, tools, and extra clothing. Some structures even had separate rooms, areas designated for different activities like food, preparation, tool-making, and sleeping. The lighting system was surprisingly sophisticated too. They used animal fat lamps with twisted plant fiber, wicks that could burn for hours, providing both light and additional heat. These lamps were often placed in carved bone holders that could be positioned around the shelter to create even lighting throughout the space. What's truly remarkable is that these weren't temporary shelters, they were built to last. Archaeological evidence shows that some of these mammoth bone houses were occupied for years, even decades. Families would return to the same structures season after season, making improvements and modifications over time. But mammoth bone houses weren't the only architectural innovation early humans developed. Across different regions and climates, they created a stunning variety of shelter solutions that show incredible adaptability and ingenuity. In areas where large animal bones weren't available, they developed pit house technology that was equally impressive. These semi-subterranean homes were dug into the earth, with only the roof visible above ground. The underground placement provided natural insulation. The Earth's temperature, several feet below the surface, remains relatively constant year-round, usually around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. That the construction of these pit houses required sophisticated understanding of soil mechanics and water management. They'd choose locations with proper drainage, dig to precise depths, and create elaborate post-and beam roof structures using available timber. The roofs were then covered with layers of bark, hides, and sod, creating a waterproof barrier that could support heavy snow loads. What's fascinating is how they solved the moisture problem. Underground dwellings naturally tend to be damp, but early humans figured out how to create effective moisture control systems. They'd line the walls with specially prepared hides, create gravel drainage systems, and even develop early forms of vapor barriers using animal fats and plant materials. In regions with abundant stone, they created sophisticated rock shelters that maximized natural protection while adding ingenious modifications. They'd build walls to close off cave openings, create internal partitions for privacy and climate control, and even develop heating systems that used thermal mass principles to warm large spaces efficiently. The social aspects of these shelters were equally important. These weren't just individual family homes, they were designed to facilitate community interaction. Many sites show evidence of shared spaces, communal cooking areas, and even early forms of neighborhood planning where multiple shelters were arranged to create protected courtyards and gathering spaces. Perhaps most impressive of all, these shelter systems were completely sustainable. Every material was renewable, every structure could be rebuilt when necessary, and the entire system worked in harmony with the natural environment rather than fighting against it. The shelter revolution wasn't just about staying warm, it was about creating the foundation for human civilization itself. These early architects and engineers proved that, with enough creativity and determination, humans could make themselves at home anywhere on Earth, no matter how hostile the conditions. Imagine trying to start a fire when it's minus 30 degrees outside. The wind is howling at 50 miles per hour, and every piece of wood around you is either frozen solid or buried under 3 feet of snow. Oh, and your life literally depends on getting that fire started, because without it, you'll be dead within hours. This was just another Tuesday for our Ice Age ancestors. And somehow they didn't just figure out how to make fire in these impossible conditions. They mastered it so completely that they could maintain fires for weeks, even months at a time. The fire-making techniques developed during the Ice Age were nothing short of revolutionary. These weren't the simple flint and steel methods you might see in survival shows. Early humans developed an entire toolkit of fire-starting methods that worked in conditions that would challenge modern survival experts with all their gear. First, there was the bow drill method, but with an Ice Age twist. They'd create friction fire-starting kits from materials that stayed dry even in the worst weather. They'd use special tinder made from dried fungus, birch, bark, and even mammoth hair that could catch the smallest spark and nurture it into flame. The genius was in the preparation. They'd spend hours during good weather preparing fire-starting materials and storing them in waterproof containers, made from animal bladders and sealed with fat. But here's where it gets really impressive. They developed what we'd now call fire insurance systems. They'd create multiple fire-starting kits and distribute them among the group, so if one got wet or damaged, there were backups. They'd also create fire seeds, partially burned materials that could be easily rekindled, wrapped in insulating materials and carried from camp to camp. The real breakthrough, though, was their understanding of fire maintenance in extreme conditions. They didn't just start fires, they kept them burning continuously for months. They developed feeding schedules, wind protection systems, and even early forms of coal banking where they'd bury coals in ash to keep them smoldering for days, without active tending. These weren't just campfires for warmth and cooking, these were sophisticated heating systems that could warm entire communities, dry wet clothing, melt snow for water, and even create hot stones for portable heating systems. Now, keeping warm was only half the battle. The real challenge was finding enough food to survive in a world where traditional food sources had either disappeared or become nearly impossible to access. What early humans accomplished in Ice Age hunting and food procurement was nothing short of miraculous. Let's talk about mammoth hunting because yes, small groups of humans with primitive weapons actually figured out how to take down 12,000-pound woolly mammoths. This wasn't just about bravery, it was about developing hunting strategies so sophisticated that they'd make modern military tacticians jealous. The key was understanding animal behavior at a level that seems almost supernatural. These hunters knew exactly when and where mammoths would migrate, how they'd react to different threats, and most importantly, how to exploit their weaknesses. They'd study herds for days, identifying the oldest, youngest, or injured animals that could be separated from the group. But the real genius was in their hunting techniques. They developed coordinated group hunting strategies that involved dozens of people working together with precision timing. Some hunters would drive the mammoth toward prepared pit traps, while others would position themselves for spear attacks. At exactly the right moment, they'd use fire to confuse and redirect the animals. And they'd even create artificial stampedes to drive entire herds over cliffs. The tools they created for these hunts were masterpieces of engineering. Spear points that could penetrate mammoth hide, throwing sticks that could deliver weapons with deadly accuracy, and even early forms of composite bows that could shoot arrows with enough force to bring down massive prey. What's truly remarkable is how efficiently they used every part of these massive animals. A single mammoth could provide meat for an entire community for months, but they'd also use the bones for tools and shelter, the hide for clothing and containers, the fat for fuel and waterproofing, and even the hair for insulation and cordage. Developed food preservation techniques that were so effective they could store meat for months without refrigeration. They'd create jerky by cutting meat into thin strips and drying it over fires. They'd render fat for long-term storage, and they'd even develop early forms of fermentation to preserve certain foods. Though hunting wasn't limited to mammoths either. They'd developed specialized techniques for hunting reindeer, bison, horses, and even dangerous predators like cave bears when necessary. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of Ice Age food procurement was how early humans turned scarcity into abundance through sheer creativity and planning. They didn't just hunt when they were hungry, they developed sophisticated food management, systems that would make modern supply chain managers envious. The seasonal food storage systems they created were incredibly advanced. They'd identify natural refrigeration areas, places where permafrost could keep meat frozen for months, and create elaborate food caches. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were carefully engineered storage systems with drainage, pest control, and even security measures to prevent other animals from raiding their supplies. That they developed what we'd now call diversified food portfolios, while mammoth hunting gets most of the attention. They were also expert gatherers who knew how to find and process dozens of different plant foods, even in frozen conditions. They'd harvest pine nuts, collect edible roots, and even know which plants remained nutritious when dried and stored. The fishing techniques they developed were equally impressive. Even when rivers were frozen, they'd cut holes in the ice and develop specialized tools for winter fishing. They'd create fish traps from woven plant materials, develop ice fishing, spears, and even use controlled fires to attract fish to breathing holes in the ice. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed sharing systems that ensured everyone in the community had access to food, even during the worst times. These weren't just feel-good social policies, they were survival strategies. By sharing resources and spreading risk across the entire group, they created a safety net that could keep everyone alive during extended periods of scarcity. The food processing techniques they developed were incredibly sophisticated. They'd render animal fat into high-energy pemmican that could last for months, create bone marrow extracts that provided essential nutrients, and even develop early forms of food combination that maximized nutritional value from limited resources. Most amazing is that all of this, the fire mastery, the hunting strategies, the food preservation and storage systems, was developed and refined during the harshest conditions in human history. These weren't desperate survival measures. They were the foundations of human civilization, created by people who refused to let an ice age define their limits. Here's something that will completely change how you think about primitive humans. While Hollywood shows us grunting cavemen living in isolated family groups, the reality is that Ice Age humans created social networks so sophisticated and that they'd make modern social media look primitive. These weren't just loose tribal connections, they were continent-spanning communication systems that shared crucial survival information across thousands of miles and multiple generations. The archaeological evidence is absolutely tools made from materials found hundreds of miles away, artistic styles that appear simultaneously across vast distances, and even evidence of shared languages and cultural practices spanning from Spain to Siberia. This wasn't accidental, it was the result of deliberate, organized information sharing that kept entire populations alive during the worst climate disaster in human history. Think about what this means. While struggling to survive in conditions that would kill most modern humans, our ancestors were maintaining contact with other groups across entire continents. They were sharing hunting techniques, trading essential materials, and even coordinating large-scale migrations. This level of organization required planning, communication skills, and social cooperation that rivals anything we see in modern society. The communication systems they developed were incredibly sophisticated. They created standardized symbols and artistic representations that could convey complex information about weather patterns, animal migrations, and resource locations. Cave paintings weren't just art, they were information storage systems, like ancient hard drives that could preserve crucial survival knowledge for future generations. But here's where it gets really impressive. They developed what we'd now call distributed knowledge networks. No single person or group had to know everything about survival. Instead, they created systems where different groups specialized in different areas of expertise and shared that knowledge across the entire network. Some groups became experts in mammoth hunting, others specialized in toolmaking, and still others focused on weather prediction and seasonal planning. The trust and cooperation required for these systems to work is staggering. These groups were literally betting their lives on information shared by people they might never meet in person. Yet somehow, they built social bonds strong enough to maintain these networks for thousands of years. Through multiple climate changes and population migrations, this wasn't just survival, it was the birth of human civilization itself. The social structures that emerged during the Ice Age were far more complex and sophisticated than anyone previously imagined. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that these weren't just loose collections of hunter-gatherer bands. They were organized societies with specialized roles, leadership structures, and even early forms of governance that could coordinate activities across vast territories. The leadership systems they developed were particularly fascinating. Rather than having single or powerful chiefs, they created flexible leadership networks where different people took charge based on the situation. During mammoth hunts, the most experienced hunters would lead during migrations. Those with the best knowledge of terrain and weather would guide the group. During toolmaking periods, the master craftspeople would direct activities. This distributed leadership model was incredibly effective for survival, because it meant that no single person's death or injury could cripple the entire group. If one leader was lost, others could immediately step in to fill the gap. It also meant that decision-making was based on expertise rather than just social hierarchy, which was crucial when the wrong choice could mean death for everyone. The conflict resolution systems they developed were equally impressive. Living in close quarters during harsh winters with limited resources should have led to constant fighting and social breakdown. Instead, they created sophisticated methods for resolving disputes that actually strengthened group bonds. They developed rituals, ceremonies, and even early forms of restorative justice that turned conflicts into opportunities for community building. The childcare and education systems were revolutionary. Children weren't just raised by their biological parents, they were raised by the entire community, with different adults taking responsibility for teaching different skills. This meant that if parents died, children didn't become orphans, they were automatically integrated into the broader social network. It also meant that knowledge and skills were passed down more reliably, since multiple adults were involved in education. Elderly weren't seen as burdens, they were valued as living libraries of survival knowledge. They were the keepers of generational wisdom about weather patterns, animal behavior, and survival techniques that had been tested over decades. The respect and care shown to elderly members wasn't just compassion, it was a survival strategy that ensured crucial knowledge wouldn't be lost. These social innovations weren't just nice-to-have features, they were the difference between life and death during the Ice Age. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Ice Age social survival was how these communities used storytelling, art, and cultural practices as actual survival tools. This wasn't entertainment, it was life and death information technology that could preserve and transmit crucial knowledge across generations in ways that were both memorable and emotionally engaging. The storytelling traditions they developed were incredibly sophisticated information storage systems. Stories about successful hunts weren't just entertainment around the fire. They were detailed technical manuals disguised as narratives. A story about tracking a mammoth would include precise information about animal behavior, weather patterns, seasonal timing, and hunting techniques, all wrapped in an engaging narrative that made the information easy to remember and pass down. The art they created served similar functions. Those beautiful cave paintings weren't just aesthetic expressions, they were technical diagrams showing animal anatomy, hunting strategies, and even star maps for navigation. The artists weren't just creative individuals, they were skilled technicians who could encode complex survival information in visual form that could be understood by anyone, regardless of language barriers. The ritual and ceremonial practices they developed weren't just spiritual activities, they were social bonding mechanisms that created the trust and cooperation necessary for group survival. Shared ceremonies created emotional bonds that could override individual self-interest when the group's survival was at stake. These rituals also served as regular opportunities to share information, plan activities, and reinforce social rules. The cultural innovations were equally crucial. They developed shared value systems that prioritized group survival over individual gain, created social norms that encouraged sharing and cooperation, and even established early forms of social insurance where successful individuals would support others during tough times, knowing they could count on reciprocal help when needed. What's most remarkable is how these social systems were self-reinforcing. The communities that developed the most effective cooperation and information sharing networks were the ones that survived and thrived. Over time, this created an evolutionary pressure that favored social cooperation, emotional intelligence, and collective problem-solving skills. The Ice Age didn't just test human physical endurance, it forged the social and cultural foundations that would eventually allow our species to dominate the planet. The survival networks our ancestors created weren't just temporary emergency measures, they were the blueprint for human civilization itself. The next time you're complaining about your Wi-Fi being slow or your coffee getting cold, remember this. Your ancestors survived the worst climate disaster in human history using nothing but their wits, their creativity, and their ability to work. Together, they didn't just survive, they thrived, innovated, and laid the foundation for everything we are today. The Ice Age wasn't humanity's greatest challenge, it was our greatest teacher. It showed us that when faced with impossible odds, humans don't just adapt, we revolutionize. We turn obstacles into opportunities, scarcity into abundance, and isolation into connection. Those mammoth bone houses, those sophisticated hunting strategies, those continent-spanning social networks, they weren't just survival tactics, they were proof that human ingenuity has no limits when we're willing to think creatively, work together, and never give up. So here's my question for you. What Ice Age are you facing in your own life right now? What challenge seems impossible to overcome? Maybe it's time to channel some of that ancient human ingenuity. Maybe it's time to think like our ancestors, creative, resourceful, and absolutely unstoppable. If you found this story as much as I did, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, what survival skill from the Ice Age do you think would be most useful today? And if you want to dive deeper into human survival stories that will change how you see the world, check out our playlist on ancient human innovations. Trust me, you won't believe what else our ancestors accomplished. Remember, you're not just a descendant of survivors, you're a descendant of innovators, problem solvers, and world changers. That Ice Age DNA is still in you. Maybe it's time to use it.